Hello and welcome to this workshop on how to build a fantasy world. I'm just doing a quick test here, just to make sure that all the audio is working. So if you can just post in the chat that you can hear me fine, that would be wonderful. I think there might be a bit of a delay, so I'll just pause for a second. Yeah, people saying they can hear me now. That's great. So, what we'll do is we'll get started. I did pre-record this yesterday because I've been suffering from a cold and I got this terrible and very sudden fear that I was going to lose my voice and I wouldn't be able to do it. So that's why I pre-recorded it yesterday. Um, it's about anyway, it is exactly 1 hour long, which worked out very conveniently, to be honest. So, and I think when we pre-record it as well, it's one of the benefits, because what I like to do in workshops is interact, obviously, and answer questions as we go along. When we do this over virtually, it's hard for me to break away and then to answer questions. So that's why the live chat is really helpful, because all throughout, if you have any questions at all, just post them in the chat and I'll answer them. I'm here the whole time. And then if we want to go into a bit more detail at the very end, I'll go over some other questions, or you can save questions for the end as well. I was plenty of time. I said 90 minutes, so there's going to be a good 25 minutes, half an hour of question and answers at the end. If anyone has any difficulties downloading the world building template, let me know as well, just because I might have to tweak this privacy settings on Google Docs. That is something I'll talk a bit about when we go into the workshop, but it's something really that I keep adding to, and it's something that you can definitely add to as well. And like I say, it's a template, so whenever you write a new story, it just becomes its own thing. So it just gives you some core physical and cultural settings to focus on when you start writing. Any other issues, just post in the chat, and we'll get started now, and enjoy, and I hope you learn a lot. Hello and welcome to this workshop on how to build a fantasy world. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Richie Billing, and if you have no idea who I am a fantasy writer from a place called Liverpool in the UK, which is probably most well known for in recent times for the Beatles. So if you're a music fan, you may recognise my accent. I do have a pretty strong accent, so I will try and talk very slowly, so you can catch everything I say. I also co-host a podcast called the Fantasy Writers Toolshed, which is devoted to all things fantasy writing. And you may also know me from my book, A Fantasy Writer's Handbook, which came out near enough 2 years ago to the day. Um, and that makes me feel a bit old. So, um, yeah, we won't go into too much detail about that. But yeah, it is. We'll talk a bit more about the Fantasy Writers Handbook towards the end. I will also let you know that I am recovering from a cold, so that's why I sound a bit nasally. If I do start sneezing, I do apologise. Um, but let's roll on. We've got a lot to cover today, and I am going to try and get through this as quickly as possible. It is going to be quite comprehensive, and at the end, we will have time for questions and answers as well. Um, so in March this year, my debut novel, Mariah's Lament, was released, and I suppose this was the big test of my own world building approach, which I call natural world building. And it was born out of the problems that I experienced when I was writing that book and other books in the past, which is having a lack of checks and balances against doing too much world building and revealing too much and spending too much time creating things that I'll never use, which I've always kind of uh, not enjoyed because I don't have much time as it is anyway. So, as we know, if we just sort of spew world building details into a manuscript, we are probably going to end up with an info dump, which is something I hate, and so do many other readers too. So, while writing Pariah's Lament, I developed my own method, which encompassed what I've learned from a lot of the greats of fantasy writing, such as Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, George R. R. Martin, Patrick Rothfuss, and of course Tolkien himself, who is probably responsible for this world building bug that we all seem to contract. Um, and each of these writers, they all taught me my own different methods, different tools, different ways to build a world. But there was always something missing, I found. So what natural world building essentially does is encompasses the principles of these writers, but adds something extra. And it's that extra thing is a way to maintain focus on what's important to your fantasy world and a way to avoid the dreaded info dump. It's the checks and balances, which I described earlier. And I used this natural world building approach for Pariah's Lament. And to be honest, I was apprehensive, but the reviews sort of speak for themselves. So many reviewers comment on the well building aspect of that book, and I mean, some people have even described it as masterful. Now, I don't know if I agree to that it's masterful, but what I wanted to do today was show you how I did it, and just tell you a bit more about the natural world building approach so that we can effectively get rid of the info dump from our writing. So before we dive into natural world building and how to build a fantasy world, I just wanted to rein things back in a bit and talk about what world building actually is. Now, the simplest definition for me is that world building is the process of creating a fantasy or secondary world from scratch. Now, these secondary worlds are completely different, completely unique from our own world. They may take influences. So, Paradise, for example, had a lot of influence from the medieval times. So, but they generally are completely fictitious worlds. And for me, that is the main reason people read fantasy, or it is for me anyway. And it's or at least certain subgenres, because if we talk about books like Harry Potter, that's sort of set in the real world and with fantasy elements. But if we look at books like high fantasy, epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, so like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, the world is what we associate with them pieces. So Middle Earth, Westeros, places like that. And I think the aim of world building, of creating a world, is to make it feel as alive as our own. And that is a tricky thing to do. And with so much to do to build the world, to decide which aspects you think are going to be relevant to your story, and then revealing the world in an interesting way for readers, that you can get really bogged down. There's so many places it can go wrong. Um, and there's so much, like I say, you can become lost. So some people never escape the world building trap and just build and build and build and never get right into writing any story whatsoever. I spoke to somebody recently who was in this camp, and he was saying, I'm only going to start writing my story when I've finished building the world. And to me, that's a form of procrastination, because how long are you going to keep building and building? Um, Another trap that we can fall into is getting so excited by all of these brilliant little details that we create that we simply insist on including every one of them in the story. And in the end, the story becomes bloated, and it plunges into the pits of the info dump. Other problems include knowing what to focus on when building something as vast as an entire world. And some of these fantasy books span universes as well. So, how do we know how much is enough? And what is the best way to reveal things that isn't going to come across as forced, like an info dump, and that readers actually enjoy and want to explore your world? There is a knack to it, and that's what we're going to go over today. And I think whenever I encounter something complex, I always try and break it down to simplify it. And that's what I've done with my own approach to world building and just world building as a whole, because there's so much to bring in. Um, and the way we're going to look at it today is we're going to break it down into two constituent parts. So we're going to first look at the mechanics of building a fantasy world. So this is creating physical land, then all the cultural um, strands of your world as well. Um, to me, that's the fun bit. That's relatively simple. It can be tricky finding inspiration, but that is the fun bit. I think the part where it goes wrong is with the second part, is how to reveal a fantasy world. Um, and the the way natural world building fits into this is it sort of brings these two different parts together um, with these things I call the three pillars of natural world building. And they're essentially three principles, three guiding rules to help us decide, firstly, whether what we, well, help us determine what we need to build first and foremost. Next, helps us decide what is relevant to the story, because something might be needed, but it might not necessarily be relevant at that particular point in the story. And finally, it's delivering the story in a way that readers love. And for me, that's where the naturalism comes into things. So these three different elements combine to complete the natural world building method. And as mentioned earlier, it's the third time I've mentioned it now, is this checks and balance. This is what these three principles provide, checks and balances against info dumps. It's sort of like a filtration system to ensure that what you build is what you need for the story, and that you identify what's relevant and to what extent, and that you reveal those lovely details that you create in a natural way that serves the story well. And by that, I mean in a way that develops the story, doesn't hold it back, doesn't drag it off into some um, meandering path that isn't really relevant. And it really does. Natural world building sounds really simple, and it is. It's a common sense approach, I suppose. Um, and this is what we're going to explore. So, before we dive any further into things and into how to build a fantasy world from scratch, so looking at the physical and the cultural strands, I wanted to talk to you about world building approaches, because I think there's so many different ways you can approach building a fantasy world. No way is the right way. Everyone has their own style, their own methods, and some may well be better than the one I'm talking to you about today. It's just whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you find the most effective method. But as someone who's written fantasy for a long time and who's read a lot too from all different types of authors, I know where things can go wrong. And that's what my method seeks to address and ultimately avoid. So I think personally it's helpful to think of world building as a spectrum or a sliding scale, sort of like what you can see there on the screen. And on the right hand side, we have the info dump, which is one of the extremes of world building. In this case, the filtration tap is essentially broken, and glorious details just spew all over the page, drowning out any story that you may have been there in the first place. Then on the opposite end, we have the minimalist approach. And here, detail is so scant that readers could pretty much wither and starve of boredom. So it seems then to make sense to find a balancing point. Um, but it's not as simple as that, as always. Um, it all depends on the type of fantasy story that you want to tell, what kind of subgenre your story fits into. And that's why it it really does help to even if you were a pantser, you make things up as you go along. It really does help to know what kind of story you're going to tell because this does influence the amount of world building or the amount of time you need to invest in world building. Um, so let's just give you a couple of examples, contrasting examples. We've first got like character-driven stories, and the focus of these kind of stories is on not too much the world, but the challenges that each character goes through, the conflicts that they have to overcome, and ultimately them achieving their goals at the end. Now, if we contrast that with um, more plot-driven and expansive stories like Lord of the Rings, um, the priority with these kind of stories is that um, there's a grand adventure in which the characters are exploring a world. I mean, in the Rift War saga, for example, they're exploring universes, they're traveling back through time. Um, all of these books are really grand in scope, and they take you on adventures through lifelike worlds. So the world building element is really significant to them stories. And as a result, you need to invest more time building the world, building the layers, histories, origin stories, all these different cultural strands, which we'll go into shortly. And that's why it really does help to define what your story is going to be like, because otherwise you're just going to be building things that you're never going to use where I know that time could have been devoted to editing, polishing, and sharpening up that story. So um, that's the what I approached with Pariah's Lament. Now, Pariah's Lament was a little bit different because it's set in a shared universe. So I work with other authors to build a collective fantasy world. For the story itself, I was given a bit of free reign to play around with the region and that particular era in time. So it wasn't too bad. And I did have a lot of freedom in that regard. Um, but my story was a very character driven plot. And as a result, I didn't invest an awful lot of time in the world building. And as we'll see as we go on, I use these filtration systems, these three principles to help work out where I was going too far with the world building and what bits that I felt were relevant, but where I could add nice flourishes to make the world feel alive and lived in. So, before we get to that point, we need to learn how to build a fantasy world. And here is a map of my world, Soria, which is from Pariah's Lament. And it's a regional story. So it just involves two kingdoms in the southern part of a continent. So it wasn't that big a deal for me to build this part of the world. If you want to build a full globe, go ahead and do it. I've done that as well. It is a bit trickier to do, a lot more to keep track of. But I do think that regardless as to whether you're a meticulous planner or a complete and utter pantser, a solid starting point is to design the physical world. And this, in essence, serves as the framework, the skeleton for everything you're going to layer on top of this fantasy land. And often the physical side is actually the easiest to build. And I find that if you follow a series of simple questions, you can cover all ground. Now you can do this in written form, but like if you're like me, you like to do things a bit more fun, a bit more visual. I always recommend drawing a fantasy map. Even if you can't draw, just sketch it out in the roughest of forms. I even drew a fantasy map on the inside of my old writing shed. Just as a little reference, quick reference there. So I've put together some questions which if you download my world building template, which you can get a copy of in the link or in the description below, sorry. And I'll also email a copy of it to you after this workshop too. I have these questions in this template, and you can just go through them, ask yourself the questions, and answer them essentially. So the first one is, what kind of a world is it? Is it like Earth, or perhaps it could be something like Terry Pratchett's Discworld, which is floating through space on the back of a giant turtle? Is it an ocean planet? Is it a desert planet like Tatooine, or a forest moon of Endor? Um, I think when you're thinking of the kind of world as well, it also at this point it also helps to think of things like the sun, the moon, the stars. You might even have multiple suns, multiple moons, and it's important to think about these things because the sun, stars, cosmology as a whole were all very important features in human lives throughout history, and it influenced everything. So, how would that influence your own world too? It's good to sort of draw parallels with the evolution of our own world as well, because I mean, obviously in the fantasy world things can go differently, but it can really help to sort of look at how humanity has evolved, technology has evolved, to really help you get into the sort of right mindset. And then we essentially zoom in further. So this is like also like pretty much like zooming in on Google Maps. So we've done the planet essentially. Now we want to zoom in and we want to look at land masses, continents, oceans, and seas, and how does all that look on the page? Where is there a desert continent? Is there an ice cap? Things like that. It just really helps to lay all that out. And then we can zoom in further, and then we can look at mountains, rivers, lakes, and the climates that all of these different things can help create. Then we can think about forests, swamps, deserts, ice caps, volcanoes, hills, valleys. I mean, if you've still got your old geography books from school, it's worth digging them out because that's what I did. Just learn how these things are formed, how do you work. And I mean, I've put a lot of guides on this together as well, on creating fantasy maps, as well as the Worldbuilding template, which you can download for free. And I've also added links to these guides in the description too. So this is basically how we come up with a physical world. We just have to go through and really just sort of chip away at different layers of development. I mean, one question that I often get asked is, how closely do you have to stick to like real world laws and principles like gravity, blue skies, green grass? Well, you don't really have to stick to it at all as long as it works for you. Um, that's the main thing. Tolkien, for example, yeah, he didn't really follow the rules to do with rivers, and it didn't really impact his story. So, I mean, it might jar with some readers if there's a river flowing uphill or a river that simply ends in the middle of a continent. But at the end of the day, it's your fantasy world. And if that's what you want to include and it works, do it. Because at the end of the day, there really isn't a right or wrong way to go about building this physical side of things. My best advice is to study a bit of the laws of geography, if you're unsure where to start in particular, and just have fun. And if you're really struggling, use map makers or generate map generators. There's loads of them on the internet, and anything like that can just really help you get along. So we're going to move on to the second part of building a fantasy world, which is the cultural side. And basically, the physical thing is, you know what I mean. We just covered it. Everything that isn't physical is cultural. That is basically it. So things that can be influenced, created, manipulated by humanity. And as an example, we've got laws, politics, religion, government, language, structures, landmarks. They're just a few. Language. I've included a little picture of King Theod in there just because I love how he talks. And this is a funny little thing. Instead of saying this, say it like King Theod. What happened? Why did it come to this? And there's loads of different things that you can develop here. So you've got philosophies, foods, music, fashion, folklore, weapons, technology, clothing, histories like world wars, civil rights, jobs, professions, vocations. It's pretty challenging, really, to have to build all of this. Um, and to be honest, if your story has got absolutely nothing to do with fashion, then you kind of wonder why you need to bother at all. Now, there might be parts in the story where fashion comes into it, but do you need to sit there and go over the origins of different items of clothing and how they developed over time based on people's personal tastes and how different events in the history of this world influence what characters wear now? Sort of like peasantry in the Middle Ages, and when after the plague there was a shortage of peasants to work in the field. So peasants all of a sudden started getting better rights. They got paid more. And as a result, they started spending more on clothes and dressed quite flamboyantly. And then as a result, um, laws were actually passed that restricted the kind of clothes that English peasants could wear. So that's just an example of how of what you can create to make this well feel lifelike. And I'm sure the more time and effort you spend going into these cultural things and developing them, it it makes your story, it makes your world more alive, essentially. But the trick is finding a home in the limited word count that we've got for all of these different points. Now, some of them are going to be definitely more important than others. And even if you're an absolute pantser, you live by making things up as you go along, it could still really help to define the general societal norms and conventions, what's acceptable, what isn't, what are the key origin stories and histories of the world that explains how they've arrived at this point in time. Are there any key religious beliefs that have influenced that? Are there any societal structures like class systems, peasant class lords, things like that? Um, the problem is, once we start on this path, it's hard to know when to stop. Um, and another problem is knowing which ones to focus on. Do we have to focus on all of them? Excuse me. By no means. It's here we can turn to some of the best fantasy writers for advice. And when it comes to developing these sort of core cultural strands, it can really help to just select between 4 and 6 main ones. And this was something that was um, suggested by Brandon Sanderson, who definitely knows what he's doing. So when we choose to develop these key cultural strands, one of the best things that you can do is to look for cultural settings that conflict with one another. Because as we know, conflict is everything to a story. We hate conflict in our own personal lives. When it comes to entertainment, all we want to read about, watch, listen about is people going through really difficult, conflicting situations. And it's quite sadistic, really, but we find it really interesting. So when we create our cultural settings in our world, it really does help to think about what our own world is like and think of all the conflict in our world. Oh, the history of man is just war after war after war. And um, even war aside, there's so many little conflicts between science and religion, for example. And we can take them same principles and apply them to our own fantasy world. I mean, how do magic and religion interact in a fantasy world, for example? So, in a world where magic exists and religion is perhaps based on faith and beliefs, where does that leave gods and goddesses if humans are capable of similar godlike feats? I mean, technology is another good one, and something we see play out in science fantasy and the role that magic plays in a technologically advanced society. So Star Wars is a science fantasy, um, and yet we see lightsabers as sort of a technological thing, but the craft of doing it is, and the sort of the force is a magical thing. So that has a curious interaction with technology there. So and recently I was watching a film which was set sort of in sort of a key turning point in the history of China, in which the samurai all of a sudden were faced with guns. So, what role does a swordsman have in a world full of guns? These little conflicts in our cultural settings really do make the world feel alive, and um, ultimately, it helps us. It gives us inspiration for the stories that we want to create, and it gives us a solid foundation upon which we can build. But like I said, it's hard to know where to stop. And one of the big problems I find is knowing what we need. What do we actually need for the story? And this is where we bring in the first principle of necessity. And this is a way, essentially, of focusing on what our story is about, building what we need to support the story, I suppose, and through the setting in the world. Um, and once we do that, once we know what we need to build, we can save so much time on not wasting building things that we're never going to use. I mean, it does help some from one perspective to know these things in the back of our minds, but more often than not, we don't need them. Um, and let's face it, none of us simply have the time to invest 20 years like Tolkien to build a Middle Earth like world. And I've never read the Silmarillion, which is most of the world building. So that goes to show that, I mean, do we actually need to go to all that effort? Um, and I think it helps to look at what is necessary to build, to create the world that we want to create. Um, and this is what we're going to talk about now. How do we determine what is necessary for the story? For planters, this isn't too much of a problem because you just build as you go. But for planners, it can, at this point, help to step away from the world building process. And I know sounds like a big deal because a lot of people think they've got to build the world first before they can do anything else. But here's where I suggest that we build to a certain point. We've got our world, we've got our foundations, and now we just want to step away and turn the focus onto the story. Think of characters, think of the premise, what your story is actually about. Um, and to do that, we often have to think about what our characters want. Who are they? I mean, for example, is a character a monk? If so, then we need to develop some religious elements. Um, if we've got a character who loves to bake, then we know that we need to develop a bit about food of the world. Similarly, if we've got a character who's a blacksmith, we need to know a bit more about the history of smithing and the kind of weapons that are made in this world. Um, and slowly, as we learn what our story is about, what we need, it becomes clear what we need to actually spend time developing. Um, and always be asking yourself where the conflict, where you can introduce the conflict. Because say if, for example, we've got a character who loves to make shields, and he always longs to make the best shield out of this precious metal. Um, this is his life goal. He wants to build this ultimate shield. But what conflicts can you introduce to stop that character from getting the shield, getting the materials that they need? Perhaps they're bandits who are sort of taking over all the mines or whatnot. Think about conflicts that prevent characters from getting what they want, and then the sort of world just grows out of the story. Um, in the end, we're left with a bit of a framework, and we're given more direction. We can see exactly what we need, so we don't have to waste time building things we aren't going to use. And then we move on to part two, which is how to reveal fantasy world. And here is where I'm going to bring in principle two of the natural world building approach, and that is relevance. Now, with all in the will in the world, when it comes to building fantasy worlds, we just can't help but create things. And let's be honest, more often than not, we don't need to do it. But they excite us. The act of creating is a beautiful thing. And it's the reason why we love fantasy, because we've got absolute freedom to create whatever we want. And basically to explore our own worlds in our own minds. And it's only natural to get a little bit excited about revealing those juicy details. And it's here we begin to flirt with the info dump. And we've had a look at necessity, but still things still slip through the gap. We need another layer of filtration, and that is relevance. And this all centers on the question that we should ask ourselves when we are building our fantasy worlds, or we meander down some cultural settings. And the question is this relevant to the story that I'm trying to tell? And if the answer is no, it might be worth cutting it out, just because the readers might not appreciate it. If they can't see the point in a flashback to 20 years before, if it's not relevant, just cut it out. It's going to slow down your story, and you're going to potentially lose readers. But there is an exception to the rule, and I always think that at any opportunity, or within reason, should I say, to add details that really make your world feel alive, that shows the reader that other people are alive within this world beyond your characters, and that they've got their own problems, their own hopes, their own dreams, and that is how essentially we create a lifelike world. So I do think if there are with relevance, it there might be parts of the story where it's not quite relevant to introduce a detail, but if it's a good opportunity and it can be done in a natural way, which is something we'll come on to shortly, then I don't see any problem with you doing little meanders here and there. It's just when we start going woo, straight down to the pit of the info dump that we need to avoid completely. And one of the ways that we can do this is by using a tool called the iceberg. Now, if you have followed world building, if you've read up on world building quite a lot, the iceberg is something that you've probably heard of. The philosophy behind it is to reveal only a small amount of the detail that we ultimately spend months creating, with the rest lingering beneath the surface. But while a theory behind the iceberg, I think, is a good one, the details on its practical application can be a little bit vague. And the only sort of advice I've been able to find from Brandon Sanderson, who is the person who taught me about the iceberg, his advice is just to pick a handful of cultural settings and focusing on developing those, introducing conflict between them. But how much do you reveal about them cultural settings, and how do we do it in an interesting and clever way that serves the story, that develops the story? We don't want the world building to hinder the story in any shape or form. It should serve the story. It should be a key part of it that really adds to it rather than detracts from it. And essentially, how do we deliver upon the two principles that we've covered of necessity and relevance? And the garden principle of the iceberg is pretty much less is more. And this is why I think it's really important to, to be aware of the iceberg theory, because it does lend itself well to that principle of relevance and necessity, because we don't want to spew loads of details to the down the reader's throat. We want to tease them in. We want to show them just a keyhole view and leave them wanting more. And this particular approach of less is more was sort of propounded by Patrick Rothfuss, and he's got a brilliant blog post on this subject, which goes on about avoiding what's sparking intrigue essentially in readers' minds, and that if the principle is a sound one, and we do it with characterization when we're building characters and revealing characters, readers tend to engage more with stories when they're not spoon-fed every last detail. When they've got to think about things or join dots, or um, they, they notice little details, and then when they go somewhere else, they see something that connects. That's what they love. They're sort of working things out as they go along, and as a result, they're more engaged. And that is a really sort of good principle to follow, to bear in mind when you're building your world, that we always want to be creating intrigue. But the iceberg doesn't teach us this last and most important part of world building, which is knowing how to reveal the details that we deem necessary and relevant in the best way possible. And here comes the missing piece. Principle 3, naturalism. Sorry. So for me, this is the missing link in the world building equation. I've in the past always been given lots of brilliant advice from writers like Tolkien, Sanderson, and George R. R. Martin, and there was always that elements of something wasn't quite clicking, because there was a key part that was missing, and it was how to reveal the world. And for me, this is the distinguishing feature of the natural world building approach, because it is the final, well, naturalism is the defining principle, and it's also the final filtration system to prevent us from straying into the realms of the info dump. And the way we achieve the natural world building approach, and we reveal the world in this sort of manner, is simply to reveal a world naturally as the story unfolds, and keeping the two principles of necessity and relevance in mind. Um, it's really easy to do, um, and um, it basically guides us to include the right amount of detail at the right moment in time. And that can be something that's really difficult to detect on our own, especially when we're writing and editing like hundreds of thousands of words. It can be difficult to really know if we've gone too far. So literally, with Pariah's Lament, I decided that I wanted to reveal the world naturally as the characters move through it. So only if they needed to go to a new town, only at that relevant and necessary point in the story, are we told about this town, its history, and its people. So when we're planning our story, we know these characters are going to go to this town. We therefore know it's necessary to build it. We reach a relevant point in the story in which to discuss the town, because they're riding up to it, or they need to go there to get supplies, for example. And we can reveal that detail in a natural way, because it's, like I say, it's necessary and it's relevant to the story. And the way we reveal things naturally is something that we'll come on to shortly. But I want to give you another example first. because I think these examples really do help illustrate the point. And this example comes from Pariah's Lament. And one of the cultural settings that we saw on the list before was currency. So in Pariah's Lament, the only reference that I ever make to the currency of the kingdom arises when one of the main characters is given a riddle to solve, and that riddle is a coin casts a large shadow. So off the back of this riddle, Edvar goes and tries to solve this riddle by getting together all the different coins. He assembles them and discusses a little tiny bit about them, not too much about them because coins are boring, let's be honest. But at this point in the story, it was relevant, it was necessary, and it was natural. It develops the story. And I think that's the key point I want you to take away, that we know when something is natural when it develops the story. It contributes to the story, progresses it forward. And that is where the world building serves the story, essentially. And I wanted to give you one more example because this is something that a lot of book reviewers, when reading Pariah's Lament, have picked out as one of their favorite examples of the world building. And I just want to show you this because it's so simple to do. And it's just knowing when to stop. And I think having these different questions in mind of necessity, relevance, and naturalism, they all help us know at which point to stop. And basically, the scene involves the other protagonist in the story, Izzy, moving through the town of Haberdam. And I always love these kind of scenes because we can reveal details of the world in a natural way. We can talk about a tanner shop because she walks past the tanners. She can smell the drying hides outside. She can hear the noises coming from within. Similarly, if she's walking past like a slaughterhouse, she can smell dead animals. She can hear the buzzing of the flies outside. Anything like that. It can all be revealed in a natural way. So in this particular scene, I wanted to get across also to reveal the wider world around Izzy and introduce the lives of other people, because I think this can be really important in helping to give your world that sort of lifelike feel. So this it's just one sentence, and it goes: in the center of the square, a group of young boys and girls chased a small leather ball around with sticks, a game known as lingas, and one that often ended with the sticks turned on each other. Now that one sentence, it advanced the story because she's walking through the square. And while the detail isn't wholly relevant, I mentioned this exception before, and this is where it comes in. This example, this sentence shows the reader that other people live in this world, that they have their own problems, their own worries, their own hopes, their own dreams, and it's revealed in a pretty natural way. And like I said, a lot of reviewers picked out this one sentence out of 110,000 words to say that this really added to the world building. So it's something that you can use too. And I think always part of the problem, I think, with straying into the info dump is an element of trust. And it's not just trusting your reader, it's trust. It's you trusting your own writing, that you're clear enough. So you've got to first and foremost trust that your reader is going to understand what you're talking about. But to help them achieve that and to help you feel more comfortable, just be as clear with your writing as possible. Use simple language. Don't complicate things unnecessarily. Add too many descriptions. And when you do go into these little things, like that's the only time I mentioned lingas in the whole story. So from that point of view, I've left the reader wanting more. I've teased them with a fractured, slightly ambiguous thing. I don't mention lingus at all. I don't tell how it's played, other than what's in that sentence. And I just give you a bit of an idea of how games usually turn out. And yeah, I suppose when you're writing these things, you don't really appreciate the impact that they can have. Um, but this is a good example, I think, that you could benefit from too. Now, there are lots of ways that we can reveal details naturally. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about, because once we are equipped with all these different tools to reveal our world in natural ways, there's no stopping us. And first on this list is just simply dropping hints as the story progresses, and as we gradually remove the shroud from our world. Um, we can introduce a bit more, tell the reader a bit more about the histories of our world and whatnot. Um, so Brandon Sanderson, the man himself, again cropping up, bit of a whiz on world building. And if you haven't checked out his lectures, I do highly recommend them. All for free on YouTube. Um, and what he suggests, which is something I always follow because I think it makes a lot of sense, is that when it comes to writing those early chapters, we want to sort of tone the world building down. Because we need to engage with the characters first and foremost. We need to care about them before we're even thinking about exploring the world. We need to build that connection. But once that connection is forged, once it's built, say 2 or 3 chapters in, we could then start to reveal a bit more about the world. If we throw too much of the reader too soon, I mean, I am one of these readers. If a writer starts throwing too many long fantasy names at me, too many place names, I can't keep track of what's going on. Just little and often. This is what we talked about before. Drip feed details into the story, give snippets at relevant points, and this all helps avoid the info dump. If you're not, if you're still not sure what I'm talking about when I mean info dump, just long passages of boring information. Um, One of the typical examples I encounter is a mentor figure spewing out details about the histories of the world. It's not, it's just a lecture. It's a monologue of everything that's in their mind at that particular given moment. And it's just boring to read. There's no dynamic conversation. And dialogue for me, this is one of the best ways to reveal information in a natural way. Um, There are a couple of great techniques I use when it comes to dialogue. And the first is to use like simple sayings and colloquialisms. So just like we say, what on earth? Our characters could say, what in Soria, which is the world that Parais Lament is set in. Again, this helps to give the reader the feel that the world is alive and lived in, that people are making these sayings up. Um, that's really effective. And another really effective way is to use something called, something that Brandon Sanderson calls maid and butler dialogue. I don't think that's too helpful a description. So I call it fly on the wall dialogue. And essentially, the reader is the fly on the wall, and they're observing the conversations of different characters. It might be secondary characters, it might be primary characters, but essentially, the reader doesn't know the same information that the characters know. Those characters are fully aware of the circumstances, the facts. So they're only going to talk about things in a natural way. They're not going to be recounting everything that happened because they know what happened. They're just going to give off snippets of information. It's similar. Say if you walk past someone in the street and they're having on the conversation with someone that they're walking with or on the phone, you hear snippets of conversation. Um, that's essentially what it's like, and that can be really intriguing. A little snippet that might say, what are they talking about there? What's going on? And it's really engaging for people to follow. Um, it sort of comes back to this naturalism It wouldn't be natural for these characters to spill out details, the ins and outs of the plot and whatnot. Um, it's just forced and really boring to read. And yeah, it comes back to this point as well. And that I mentioned earlier that if we spoon feed people information, they're not gonna engage. It's boring for them to read. If we give them snippets that and ask them to join the dots, then they have to engage with it. They have to think, and that makes for a more interesting read. So, last one on this list is using different perspectives, and this is something I love to do. I just love to introduce or create pretty much secondary characters and just temporarily bring them into the fold, give them their own sort of perspective, their own chapter, and this just helps you add layers to the world. Perspectives are so important. Everyone sees the world in so many different ways. So, for example, I have a character called Vil who lives in the countryside but absolutely hates the countryside. He's a city boy. So, in his only chapter, he's having to walk through um, forests, through mud, um, and it just gives you that sort of different angle because that character he hates them things. So that's all the conflict in his life. It's engaging to read. Um, Similarly, if you uh, have different kingdoms, different parts of the world that you want to explore, that you want readers to know about, introducing characters um, from those parts of the world can really help to ex- develop the world and reveal it in a natural way, which is always the key. Natural, natural, natural. So let's just summarize this world building approach. First of all, well, it should be, is this detail necessary to the story? Not relevant. I do apologize. Secondly, is this detail relevant to the story? And attached to that, can we reveal this detail at a relevant point in the story? And third, we must ask ourselves, how can it be revealed in as natural a way as possible? And like I said before, for the avoidance of doubt, a 4-page lecture from some mentor figure like a wizard doesn't count as natural. And to help us even further, it really does help when building our world to think about sparking intrigue, sparking curiosity. And one way of doing this is by introducing conflict. I also implore you to not follow these principles too stringently, particularly number 2 about relevance, because it's our job as world builders and as writers to make that world feel as alive as possible. And there are times where we just have to break away from the plot, from the character development, from the premise, to just add these little flourishes. So, like before, I introduced an example about kids playing a game called Lingas. That is a perfect example of something that doesn't quite isn't quite relevant to the story, but it makes the world feel alive. It draws the reader in. And something that we can also do to make this world feel alive is using our 5 senses: sight, sound, smells, taste. Again, that's a brilliant and natural way to reveal things by using these senses. When we move through the world ourselves, think about how you react when we smell something. It was only before I was walking down the street and I smelled a log fire or a barbecue because I was by the park. Instantly, I'm starting to think of images in my mind. Your characters can do exactly the same as they're walking through your world. They can smell things that jogs memories. They can hear things, taste things, and you can use these opportunities to reveal other parts of your world, memories and stuff like that, which you can tie in with your lovely world building details. Before we move on to our question and answers, I just wanted to give you a few more world building tips. We have covered quite a lot. There is so much more to go into. And this is probably just the start. So One thing I like to do is use lists of questions, and if you download the Worldbuilding template, you will get these lists of questions as part of the template itself, which will help you build your own fantasy world. You can also try and look for lists of Worldbuilding questions on like the website of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. And there's loads of different websites that have lots of great Worldbuilding questions. This can be great to sort of give you inspiration and give you a bit of focus and structure if you're a bit daunted by the prospect of creating a whole world. Something as well that I find really beneficial is playing computer games, because they can teach you so much. Games like Age of Empires, Total War, Civilization 5, and even the Elder Scrolls, even though like the latter one is a fantasy game, it's rooted in history, medieval history, and you can get loads of ideas for like different weapons, different clothes, and you get these visual interpretations of things which can really inspire ideas too. So I also suggest playing computer games. It's fun as well, and if anyone says, "Why are you wasting your time playing computer games?" you can just say it's research. Um, Another thing, go out and explore things in the real life, in the real world. Sorry. Now that lockdown's over, we can go out and do these things. We can go to castles. We can go to historical sites, scenes of battles. Um, I don't know if you're based in the UK, but there's in Wales. I understand there's a full medieval village. You can go and explore that. If you don't get any ideas from that, I don't know where you would get ideas from. And then you can join communities like Reddit's Our Worldbuilding, which has hundreds of thousands of people in. You can post your ideas, get feedback. If you're stuck on any niche questions which you're not too sure about, you can post them in there and get some feedback. And I mentioned before about Brandon Sanderson's college lectures on Worldbuilding. I think there are two or three on there now from the years, and they're all free on YouTube. If you're looking to learn more about fantasy, writing fantasy generally, go and check out them lectures, because it's like a full college course for free. It's insane. I when I first started out, I sat down, treated it like a university college course, and just went through, made notes, did all the exercises, and it helped me so much. So you might benefit from that as well. And something that uh, I have had to go with myself, and I have found it beneficial, is to experiment with the extremes on our Worldbuilding spectrum. So have a go at writing minimalist fantasy. There's no Worldbuilding at all. I think Patrick Rothfuss was a character who said was somebody who said that there's no reason why you can't set fantasy stories in one room, and yeah, there's no Worldbuilding involved at all, or a lot less anyway. Um, and then you can experiment with the info dump as well, and going down the far extreme. And then you just gain an understanding for what is involved with each of these different stages, and then learn how to temper each one and find the right balance. That, I don't know what the D's was meant to be. Should have deleted that one. Sorry, you're not missing anything. Before we move on, I just wanted to give you a quick give a quick shout out to a fantasy writer's handbook. And if anyone is looking to learn more about how to write a fantasy novel, a fantasy writer's handbook is available in paperback and in ebook. I think it's about $2.99, $3.99 in dollars. It's got loads of great feedback. Something that makes me extremely proud is that well, I think a few authors now have written to me to tell me that it's helped them land their first book deal, which is amazing, because I never expected that when I set out to put that together. And if you want more writing tips, head over to my website, richiebilling.com. Link is in the description as well. Join my online writing group. I'm going to send you an invite anyway. It's up to you if you join. But if you want to discuss more about Worldbuilding, share your ideas, get feedback, connect with fellow writers that you can work with as beta readers and whatnot, join my writing group. There's like 170 people in there. Really nice people. Everyone's really engaged and enthusiastic, and it's a great place to meet people. If you like content like this, audio, something to listen to, Fantasy Writers Tool Shed podcast, worth checking out. I think our world building episode is the most popular one on there. So if you want to learn a bit more and you're not sick of hearing my voice, then go and check it out. And lastly, my publisher of Metal and Magic Publishing also has lots of guides on world building and whatnot like that. So thanks so much for tuning in today. And now it's over to you. And if you have any questions, please post them in the competition in the chat, and I will answer them. So I do apologise. There was a bit of delay there between me transitioning over from the workshop to this thing. So you probably get a few shots of me just idly sitting there. So I do thank you all for watching this. I hope you found it useful. It was great fun to put together. I love world building. It's one of my favourite things about fantasy. It's probably the reason why I read so much fantasy. And yeah, well, you've asked some great questions. I'm just going to go in order. And Colleen, maps. I love maps because it can really, you can just create everything there and then right on the page in front of you. And I don't know, I'm someone who likes to sort of look at maps as well, and I like to explore, and I like to wonder what could be in these mountains over here. And I think for me that can really help to jog ideas and inspire ideas, because if I'm just sitting there thinking about it and trying to picture it in my mind, it's not as, I don't think it's as easy as having something visual. But it's all personal preference. Like, some people get a bit more ideas like that. I mean, in terms of creating one, it doesn't have to be a work of art. Just draw something. I'm useless at drawing as well. You should see some of my maps. I just sketch it out. But a few people have recommended other things there. So Incarnate, there's a free version of that, which I've used as well. And you can just basically drag and drop little elements and create a map there and then. And yeah, it's something that the more you use, the better you get at it as well. It's only simple. So it's worth giving it a go. So thanks for your question there, Colleen. Hope that's useful. Rob, you've asked about creating an original world. So like medieval Germany, Western European world. I mean, this is a criticism I see too quite often. But as someone who has grown up sort of going to Ireland, I've grown up in the UK, going like Lake District in Wales. That is the landscape that I know, and I love it. And that is why I sort of do associate with fantasy. And I suppose I would struggle in some writers, also say some readers' perspectives, because it's what you'd expect. But I do experiment as well by introducing some extremes into, or twisting the familiar. So introducing different kinds of trees, maybe bit creepy looking. I mean, like thin trees, like gnarled and bent and broken. I've tried creating unique landscapes in a few short stories of mine. So it is difficult, I think, to completely break away from what we know, because, like I say, it's all we know at the same time. But you can, when it comes to like creating demon planes and stuff like that, you can sort of envision something that is brutalist and and I mean, the natural reaction is to go to like fire and pits of flames and stuff like that. But I think it can be quite useful to think of things that people really hate, or people love, and then sort of look at why they like them things, and then you can start to play around with twisting what people expect of the world. So I mean, Tolkien and Ents, for example, like, no, who'd have thought trees could move and destroy castles, for example. So yeah, I think you just got to really push yourself to think of weird and wonderful little spins on things. You can never really completely break away from what we've got, but and what we know, but it's something that we're going to try and do. So hope that helps and it wasn't too rumbly. Christine, yeah, thanks very much. And I mentioned mentor characters very briefly in that, and the typical mentor character is a wizard. I'm not saying just because I've mentioned that you shouldn't do a wizard kind of character. I mean, I love mentor figures too. They're some of my favourite characters. And a lot of stories need mentor characters. If we look at the hero's journey, for example, all them kinds of stories have mentors and they serve a purpose. I think with Pariah's Lament, I just wanted to do something a bit different because not all people have mentors, and a lot of people are sort of their own mentors. They have to sort of grow and push themselves and overcome obstacles on their own. So yeah, definitely come over and come to Liverpool and get a pint now that it's all open again. That'll be good to meet up. Ben, biggest signs that a story is actually lacking in world building details and can do with giving more info. That is a good question because so often it's the opposite, and we're looking at trimming the fat rather than injecting a bit more into the story. And I think when it comes to adding more, we need to probably take a step back from the story and ask ourselves some questions about our characters, the past, their pasts, where they're from, and the immediate world around them. So if they're from a town, let's explore a bit more about the town. And I always think it's probably easier maybe to build from this perspective of lacking rather than having too much, because when you've got too much you love all those details, so it's harder to choose ones to remove, I suppose. But when you've got to add more to the story, you know exactly what you need, so you highlight areas where maybe beta readers have said this isn't quite doing it for me, it's a bit flat. If descriptions are a bit bland, if characters are just literally moving from A to B and there's nothing happening in between, them sort of journeys, them explorations, that is where the world building you can start to reveal. So look for them kind of scenes where characters are moving through the world. If it's just bland, if it's just dialogue, if it's just them just literally skipping from plot point to plot point, it's not an engaging experience. You need to show that they're alive. The world around them is alive, and I think that's what I was trying to get across in the workshop. That it's up to us as world builders to create a world that is just as alive as our own one, and that because that's depending on the genre you like to write in. That is one of the biggest reasons why people love to read fantasy. So Geraldine's asked a question about the medieval setting. How much contemporary language should I include? So language I always think is a funny one because I love the medieval period and I do write a lot about that. But should you use language that from ye olden times? Maybe I don't think so. I think it's just going to really hinder the story because nobody speaks like that anymore. It's not relevant. It doesn't speak to the reader, and I just think we shouldn't change your voice. You should or the voices of the characters. If they say, I think I like the idea of putting some slang in there. So if we've got a character who's got a bit of an accent, say he talks a bit like this, or he misses letters off, so they say going instead of going. Scousers do that a lot. Miss our G's. You can put accents in with your writing. I mean, one of the worst examples of doing it, I'd say, is probably H.P. Lovecraft, because whenever he put accents and like he sort of phonetically wrote out how the characters spoke, it was an absolute nightmare to read. And I ended up just skipping it. But little sort of accents here and there are quite inoffensive to readers, and it can help show, without going too far, that there's different languages or there's different ways of speaking, and again, that makes the world feel more alive and lived in. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Good question there. Rob has asked. Oh, he's got the same perspective. Yeah, no problem. I just love that that landscape. So it just depends on the kind of world that you want to create. It just depends. And when you start building like your climates and things like that, I always think you've got to link things in compelling ways. So if you want a forest, you've got to have mountains, you've got to have rivers, you've got to have lakes, because that's the kind of landscape that you'd expect. If there isn't, there's not to say that you can't do that, but I always think that you need to come up with reasons. So has magic influenced a sudden lack of water, or the trees have all disappeared? But I don't know what you could do, but there's always a reason, and with fantasy there's no limit to the reasons that we can introduce. Kirsty's asked a question. In my first book, my main character from a fantasy world entered the real world, but as story develops since back to the world scenes. My editor advised against putting the fantasy map in, as they thought it would confuse the reader. So I loved the idea of introducing the map, and because if it's a real world story and you're going into a fantasy world, we can just Google what the real world map is. We don't really need that, but to really sort of get into your fantasy elements of that world, I think a map would be really curious. I mean, and intriguing to look at as well. That's one of the reasons I love maps, is because they can help make the world feel alive. You can sort of follow where the characters are moving, and that's something I really love about the genre. So I don't think it will confuse the reader. I mean, if it's clear from the story that it's a bit of a Harry Potter element, like you go through platform 9 3/4 kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think it's confusing at all. And I mean, I've even toyed with the ideas of having city maps, or like I showed you there, like I had a regional map. A map is good, so I love maps. Just get them in. Any more questions? Then I think we've. I'm just checking to see if we've got any more. I don't think we do. But if you do have any more questions, please fire them out. I will just hold on for a couple more minutes. I do hope you've enjoyed this. It's been really fun, like I said, to put this together. I am going to do a lot more of these workshops, and particularly next month, I'm going to do a workshop on SEO for writers. So if you've got a website and you want it to do a bit more for you, if you're not getting any traffic, then I can help you do that, because my day job is digital marketing, and based on using everything that I've learned in my current job, I've managed to grow my website to pretty significant levels, and I get hundreds of people coming to my website every day, and that's growing all the time. And when these people are coming to my website, I'm not paying for this, and I set my website up in a way that is attractive to people, that they join our community and they get free things, blah blah blah, and down the line they hopefully build a hopefully, like I say, build connections, build friendships, and buy books. That's the aim. So that's what the next workshop's going to be about. It's going to be about SEO, and I'm going to teach you skills that you can use when you're writing for your website. So doing keyword research, knowing how to use keywords, how to structure your articles so that they rank in Google. And these are going to be invaluable skills, because if you want to make money from writing and you don't want to work a boring 9 to 5, or you don't want to be fed up with working crappy little jobs, you can use these skills to go off and get copywriting jobs. And it's so easy to do. I'll even go over that, show you how to do that. And something I'm also going to be offering as a little extra, if people wanted to go for that, is a site audit. So using everything that I've done, all the tools that I have, and all the experience that I've got, I will review your website, and I'll tell you, provide suggestions on where you could improve, and on things that are holding it back, and I'll also give you help learning how to research keywords and things like that. So that's probably going to be end of July, early August. What I'll do is add you to my community. You'll get an invite to the writing group as well, and then you can obviously opt out if you don't want to get the emails and blah. But yeah, you'll also be informed, and you'll also get 50% off the next workshop as well. So it's going to be interesting. So as a benefit of being part of the community, you get discounts on all the workshops that I do in the future. So I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed today. I hope it's been informative. You can of course watch this whenever you want. It's yours now forever. I'll send you the link a bit later on, and thank you very much. If anyone's got any more questions, just drop me an email. You've got my email address, and I will do my best to answer them. So thank you very much, and I'll speak to you soon.